Hi, everyone. I see that we've got a good group coming in, and I know we have quite a few more who are going to join us. We'll go ahead and get started so that we can be efficient with your time and have questions or time for any questions that you have at the end. My name is David Koenig. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of the DCRO Institute. I'm also a qualified risk director, and I'm happy to be with you today. Our session is going to be fairly brief, but I want to give time for people who have questions to ask in chat or as we have time at the end, if you want to unmute yourself and raise your digital hand, happy to answer your questions that way as well. Today, we're going to talk about something that the DCRO Institute uses with people who come through our programs, but also more generally, to help people deal with the environment that we're in now from a risk perspective and understanding how risk impacts the way in which we function individually and collectively in groups. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start our presentation. And again, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So I have a few goals for our session today. The first is to help you understand this concept of risk personalities. Some of you who have been through our programs already have discovered what your risk personality is. For many of you, this is the first time you've seen this term. But when we think about risk, risk is something that impacts everything we do. Every decision your brain makes is a risk-adjusted decision. Oftentimes, you're not aware of it. But you have a personality around risk, particularly risk as threat. We're going to explore that today to help you understand what that means and how it impacts the way in which you work with others. That personality drives your response, particularly when risk is perceived as a threat or significant uncertainty, both for us individually and collectively, because groups have a collective risk personality as well, and we're going to explore that in a bit too. We want to identify the tools, the ones that we're using at the Institute, in order to help people understand their risk personalities and how to stay strategic. In the environment we're operating in, it's pretty difficult to stay strategic because we're facing so many uncertainties and so many threats. But that's really important for us, particularly as we want to begin the steps towards using this knowledge to improve our effectiveness in the boardroom. This is a difficult time. As you'll see in this next slide, this is a slide that I show in many of my presentations. So if you've seen this before, the only change in it over the last 3 or 4 years is I've added the word tariffs. But otherwise, all of this stuff has been in play for quite a while. It's something that describes an environment that most board members would say is the most difficult environment they've ever faced. Unfortunately, it's probably the easiest environment any of us are going to face going forward, at least for quite some time. The reason for that is many of these things that are depicted on this screen interact with each other. They exacerbate each other. Uncertainty and change in one creates uncertainty and change in the others. And with so many forces moving at very fast speeds, not just technology, but geopolitics as well, we're faced with a situation that most of us have not had to deal with. So we want to understand what that does to us. Again, these are oftentimes the way in which risk is presented to us as a threat or an uncertainty, as opposed to the way in which we try and teach in our programs, helping people learn to embrace this. This is what we're presented with in our daily lives. What we know about risk in terms of how it impacts the way in which we operate as individuals is that our brain processes it in two different ways. Some of you are familiar with Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, work by Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, around the way in which our brains process risk. But that's depicted here on the two axes that you see on the left. There's a scale that ranges from intense to composed in terms of an emotional response we have to risk. This is a fast response. This is a response about survival. The intense response comes from people who you might scream or hear screaming, jumping up and down, shouting, "We're all going to die, we're all going to die." Or people at the lower end who are more composed, who feel these things internally, but you don't see them externally. Again, this is a very fast response. It's about survival. The second way in which our brains process risk is a cognitive or strategic process. This is the one that's most important to us in the boardroom. It ranges from being fairly carefree, which is let's try things and see what happens, on up to prudent, where someone needs lots of data, lots of process, lots of information in order to feel comfortable with the risks that they're facing. Because this uses more energy and because it's slower, when we're threatened, our brain tends to shut down this part. and tends to focus on the emotional response. That keeps us from being strategic. It keeps us from thinking about the long term, the long run, the things that the board is supposed to be focused on. Our minds are designed for that. We want to be able, though, to try and keep the emotional response from dominating what happens in the boardroom. Two other things I want to point out is that our brains also have difficulty processing things that change very slowly. They don't change in the time or the rate at which most things around us do. And the example I have here are global temperatures. While we're starting to see more signs of it, they've been rising for quite some time, and they've been a concern for quite some time. But there's still plenty of people who don't think they need to act because, again, the perception is difficult for our brains until those slow events become fast events, like those floods that are shown here in this particular picture. Fast events, again, then turn us into emotionally responding beings unless we've been thoughtful, unless we've been strategic, unless we've used the cognitive part of our brain to prepare for these events so that we don't trigger those emotional responses. Now, I'd mentioned Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky before. Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for their work on prospect theory, and Tversky would have as well, except he had passed away before the prize was given. One aspect of their work is that risk impacts the way in which we make decisions based on how it's framed. So in this particular case, what I'm showing you is an example of a public health issue, where the director of public health is presented with two solutions to address the emerging issue. In the first choice, they're told you'll surely save 200 people. And in the second choice, there's a 1/3 chance of saving everyone and a 2/3 chance of saving no one. In studies, when people are given these choices, 70% of people choose option one, even though statistically, from an expected value standpoint, these are exactly the same. But we reword that and present it to them again. In this case, if you make that first choice, 400 people will die. And if you make the second choice, there's a 1/3 chance that no one will die and a 2/3 chance you'll save no one. In this case, people overwhelmingly switch and choose option number two. Again, statistically, from an expected value standpoint, these two are the same. In fact, all four of them are the same. What this tells us is our brains don't always process risk rationally. A lot of times, it's the emotional response that dominates and distorts the way in which we're thinking, again, as individuals, and as you'll see in a bit, as groups as well. So what is this thing we call a risk personality? Well, this is actually how your brain has been wired. This comes from all of your ancestors, everything that's happened to bring you to this world. Your brain has developed an innate sense of how it wants to respond to risk. In this case, again, as I'd mentioned, we're talking about risk as threat or risk as uncertainty. This affects how you display your reactions. So, for example, when I talked about the emotional response of being intense, someone jumping up and down and screaming, that's something you see very visibly. And your responses impact others. It doesn't mean you have to be someone who responds emotionally. You could be very calm, and your risk personality will impact other people because they see that and they might be expecting something different. We're trying to describe who you are in terms of the way in which risk impacts the way in which you make decisions. Now, the DCRO Institute works with a group that's based in the UK, Psychological Consultancy Limited, and they've developed this thing they call the risk type compass. It's a very helpful tool to help us put people in different buckets and different ways of describing, again, their risk personalities. You can probably see this on your screen, or it might be too small, but they range from wary at the top, prudent, deliberate, composed, adventurous, carefree, excitable, and intense. And then there's one in the middle that's referred to here as axis or axial type. We'll get to that one later in the presentation. But one thing to know is that in all of the data that they've generated, and they've put tens of thousands of people through these assessments that they use to generate this, is that roughly 11% of the general population falls into each of these 9 categories. So what that tells us is there's no one category that's better or worse, no one risk type that's better or worse. Otherwise, evolution would have shifted us into one of those buckets more heavily. It's not true, though, when we get to places like the board. That distribution is different. Now, how do you know where your risk personality is? Well, remember back a few slides when I talked to you about these two axes, the emotional and the cognitive axis. This company scores your reaction to various risk scenarios on an emotional level and on a cognitive level. And when you plot where you are on each of these axes, you wind up with an intersection and a dot. We call this risk personality, or this dot, your risk personality. I'll give you a sense of a few of those here. One of them is a deliberate type. So you'll see the dot where it wound up. The dot is off to the calm side in terms of the emotional response and slightly towards the measured side. These people tend to be very calm and sure-footed. They like to do things by the book. They like to plan ahead and be well prepared. The kind of thing you might hope for from an air traffic controller or someone in high responsibility that might be high stress, but you want them to be very thoughtful and prepared and not respond to things emotionally. Moving around a bit, the adventurous type. The adventurous type's also very calm. So at that same place pretty much on the emotional scale, but they tend to be a little bit more daring. They're willing to take chances. They like to try things that are new, and they'll be frustrated if anyone is trying to hold them back. Continuing around to the intense type. Now, this group happens to be very emotional. They tend to see things very personally or in personal terms. They're very alert to risks. They're slightly daring, but what they're most concerned about is, will they be disappointed? Will it affect them personally? And they will not let the same thing happen to them twice. These are different types. These are different risk personalities. As I mentioned, there are 9 of them. How do we get to that place? Well, there's a 15 or 20-minute assessment that takes place, and this is again done by this group in the UK that we work with. Once you've completed that, you get a fairly comprehensive report, I think it's 20 pages or so, detailing different aspects of you individually and generalizations about your risk personality type. Then we spend about 45 minutes with you going over those details to help you understand where to position yourself. For example, if you're trying to seek board service or board committees that you're serving on, helping you understand the strengths that you bring to these discussions, again, based on your risk personality, and trying to help you understand who might be different from you in the room so that you can respond to them and avoid having their responses impact you. Again, particularly on the emotional side, we're trying to avoid triggering that emotional response. And understanding each other and understanding ourselves is an important step in that. So again, this is for individuals. This is for one person, you hopefully will go through this and understand yourself. But what we also know is that groups have risk personalities and groups have different responses to risk. I'm going to highlight just a few things here. One of these, if you may not have come across, is something called the social amplification of risk. Now, this is a study that was done back in the 1980s by the Kaspersons, Paul Slovic, and others, where they looked at what causes certain events to have an impact that was much greater than anybody had anticipated. 2 examples are, for example, the subprime crisis and the pandemic. Well, what they discovered is that people evaluate emerging risks on 2 scales. The first scale is called dread. In other words, how is it going to impact me? How is it going to impact our group? Is it something that's increasing? Is it something I have no control over? And the second one is, how well do we understand it? Is it something we've prepared for? Is it something that experts know what's going on and will control? If the answer to these is that you have a high level of the unknown and a high level of dread, we wind up seeing risks impact us in magnitudes beyond what any planning had been. But the good news is we only need to interrupt one of these 2, either the dread side or the knowledge side. And by keeping ourselves strategic and focused in our group discussions, we can address one or both of these. Groups also tend to get very short-term in their thinking, in the same way that individuals do when they're under threat. They tend to cluster around themselves. The expression in the United States in the Old West was circle your wagons to protect. They tend to look for data that confirms what they've been doing all along. And as Michelle Wooker helpfully points out in her book about the gray rhino, they also tend to deny things until it's too late. These are natural responses. These are things we're trying to avoid when we're under threat so that we can stay strategic. Board composition can also be a problem. We hear people talk about diversity, and that means many things to many people, different things to many people. What we're looking at here, though, in terms of diversity of risk personalities is if you are too conforming, too many people who want things to be done by the books, you may be too slow. You may therefore not be particularly resilient. If you've been very successful, you may see that everything around you is working and you may say, well, we don't need to change. You may not have enough people in the room pushing you to try new things. You may be too cautious, too many people who are wary or afraid of risk, and you may be too comfortable. These are just things that happen without your knowledge because you're unaware of the risk personality distributions that are in the room. So I'm going to give you a quick example of two boards. Both of them have very talented people on the boards. In this first one, we'll call them the unaware collective. They have bold, enterprising people. They have cautious and deliberate people on the board, but they've never taken the time to understand why it is that they're different. Since the bold members want to continue to grow, they want to continue to push for new things, and the more conservative, cautious, and deliberate ones want to make sure everything is being done by the books and that they've covered everything that might go wrong, they tend to have more conflict. That conflict eventually erodes trust. And if anybody has read any of the work that I've done and hear from others too, trust is the most essential element for us to be effective in our groups. If that trust is eroded, we are by definition less effective board members. But let's look at the second board, the aligned collaborative. Again, a very strong group of people, very smart, lots of distribution of different risk personality types in there. But they started by understanding each other. So that was part of their onboarding process. That was part of their board recruiting process to find out who it is that's in the room. And while they discovered there is a mix of personalities, including some that are opposites of each other, some carefree and prudent members, some who would normally be in conflict, since they knew that in advance, what they wound up doing was developing a decision-making plan that emphasized the strengths of each. So in this particular case, the bold people, the ones who were more carefree, they were allowed to think of new ideas. And then it was the responsibility of the other board members on the opposite side of them to challenge those, to stress test them, to look for things in the assumptions that were being made that might not work out. This wound up being a collaborative approach and built trust and extended the relationships into the future. So this board could actually be more creative. It could take more risks because they trusted each other. This is a big difference, and you can't know what you don't have the data on. You can't know what the distribution is unless you've gone through these kinds of assessments. So part of what we do at the DCRO Institute, again, we're a collaborative, we're a nonprofit collaborative of board members and C-suite executives. We try to bring resources to people to help them understand how to use risk well in the boardroom, in the executive suite, and board committees, wherever it may be, to help you as individuals participate in these most effectively. And what we'll try to do is to show things to you like how well dispersed is your board in terms of risk personalities? Do you have concentrations that you need to be aware of? Are the people on the right committees? Are there gaps in terms of risk personalities that you might want to address through board refresh? Just because you see a bunch of different dots doesn't mean that you have a diverse board. Sometimes there are concentrations that are of concern. So let me take a look at one example with you. These are 6 people. They're all successful executives. They're all successful board members. You could be quite happy having them as your board. If you don't know this about them, you don't know that you have 3 adventurous types, 1 excitable, 1 intense, and 1 wary. You might not think there's an issue there, but the truth is the wary and the adventurous types are exact opposite types of each other. Those are the ones that create conflict. Those are the ones that trigger the emotional response in each other. But perhaps even more of concern is that when you look at the strength of the risk personalities in this group, you find, as you might not be surprised by, the adventurous types dominate. But the wary type also has a very strong position. What this winds up doing is, again, increasing the chances of conflict, particularly under stress. Every group has a risk personality, not just the individuals, but a collective. This particular group that I just showed you, they're carefree. That might not be what you expect your board to be. In fact, if you're working in an area where human safety is a concern, I'm not sure you want a carefree board. What if this is your audit committee and you weren't aware that these are the personalities that you brought to it? Do you want a carefree audit committee? And the question is, does this align with your overall risk appetite? Again, without the data, you can't know that. You can make a judgment, you can make a guess, but the truth is you're just not going to know until you've done these kinds of assessments. Now, I'm going to take you for one other example here, and this is actually very recent. This is a group of people who are at a climate summit. They are looking for how to influence their boards to pay more attention to climate change. Remember going back to that earlier slide where we have difficulty sometimes with slow changing things like temperatures or other things that may be happening and emerging around us at a pace that's just not normal for us. Well, this group is somewhat frustrated because they've been trying to raise the alarm about climate change for quite some time. Well, this group, if you look at the center of gravity for them, is between excitable and intense. Maybe that's not surprising because they are concerned about climate change. But the dot on the right on the other side is where most board members are. The center of gravity among all the board members that we've had go through our programs is actually exactly opposite of this group. That's going to breed frustration on both sides. Remember back to the two different kinds of boards we had? This one is going to continue to have conflict, going to continue to have a reduction in trust because they don't understand why it is that the other doesn't see their point. Here, on the other hand, by knowing this, and this was actually something that came up in the conversations I had, by knowing this, the group that's trying to affect change can try to meet the normal, the regular, the average group of board members where they are and turn the conversation into something that's quite familiar and comfortable. So you don't trigger the emotional response in them, and you don't get the emotional response triggered in you because they're not responding in the same way that you do. We also look at the distribution of risk tolerances. So when you get your individual report, you find out how comfortable you are with risk and also how much you can vary your risk tolerance depending on the situation you're in. In this case, we're looking at a distribution of 10 different people, might be part of a board, might be part of an executive committee, and understanding who is more comfortable with risk and who is less comfortable with risk helps us in our conversations. Again, this is in some forms of emotional intelligence that allows you to be more effective with colleagues that you want to be effective working with. Now I'm going to go to one last risk personality type. You heard me mention it earlier. These are the ones in the middle, the axis or axial type. This is a really important type to have in your board. They have part of everybody in them. They have part of all of these risk personalities. They're neither extremely emotional or calm, neither extremely daring or measured in what they do. They tend to understand others. They neighbor every other type. The axial types have no opposites. They can be a bridge then between those opposites. When you remember the example I just gave you showing the adventurous types and the wary type, there was no axial type in the middle to bridge that gap. But having an axial type on the board or in your group can help reduce the chance of conflict. Again, they are able to be empathetic because they have parts of all of these different risk personalities in them. And one of the things they're particularly good at is driving a group discussion towards consensus. Well, this might not surprise you. It's an ideal trait for someone to serve as a board chair or board committee chair. These are the people who can bring us together, bring all of the disparities, all the different views, all the different risk personalities to a place of understanding. So what is the impact of doing this? Well, we have a series at the DCRO Institute. All the publications are free on our website called Building a Better Board. We're looking at ways that you can improve the effectiveness of your board. And this is one of the ways through understanding risk personalities. We want to align our personalities with board and board committee needs. We don't want a lot of carefree people on our audit committee. If we have an innovation committee, we don't want a lot of wary people on our innovation committee. We're trying to put people in a place where they can be most effective. We want you and you're seeking board seats or your service today to be most effective in what you do. We want to make sure we bring together a diverse set of risk personalities. Again, this is one aspect of diversity that most don't consider, because when we're doing strategic planning, when we're responding to events and things that are new, this kind of approach brings more creativity into the discussion. So there's a lot of value that comes from that. And getting back again to what I talked about in the two different boards, we get more collegiality when we work together in these ways because we don't trigger the emotional response in the others, again, particularly the ones that are opposite for us. And we keep ourselves using this cognitive strategic response. Sometimes threat and sometimes surprise comes out of nowhere. But if we've spent time being strategic and thinking about how we're going to respond, if we've spent time understanding each other, we won't respond in the same way we would if we didn't do that work. We'll understand each other better. So when we work with boards, we work with executive suites, we do the same thing we do with an individual for every person who's in the group. They all get their individual profile and an individual consultation. The board as a whole is profiled. Remember I said every group has a risk personality? So we profile that for the board and for key committees of the board. Again, I mentioned audit, innovation, risk. You might have your executive committee do that. And we look for places where there might be conflict to help people understand each other. We then meet with the leadership of the board, typically chair, vice chair, chair of NomGov, to talk about what they want to do in terms of bringing their group together. And if they wish, we'll do a facilitated study with the entire board. Well, we'll run through some scenarios and ideas to help them understand how they might be triggered by certain situations and help them understand each other and everyone who's in the room. I'll give you a link to this later on, but I just wrote an article in Directors and Boards magazine about how to use these risk personalities that includes when you use them for board refresh. So almost everybody has a skills matrix when they're recruiting people to their board. Almost no one has another column that looks at risk personality. But that's another thing that we can do, because when we have someone depart the board and a new person come in, it shifts the risk personality of the group. And we want to make sure it's shifting it towards the dot that we want in terms of our risk appetite. We want to make sure we're not creating more concentrations or we're not increasing the likelihood of conflict. So this helps us in our ongoing work to help build better boards. So again, the goal for us is to not be this unaware collective that has conflict and it's not sure where it's coming from, but it builds up over time. And to be this one that understands they have differences in the room, but understands where those come from. That it's not that this person is being difficult. It's not that this person is ignoring you. That's how their brain processes risk. So we talk to each other in the language, we assign each other to tasks and responsibilities that bring out the best in our risk personalities and help to keep us strategic. So again, a couple of things I want you to take away from today. Your risk personality is hardwired. It's who you are, especially when risk threatens you. You do have the ability to change situationally, but under threat, you're going to revert to your dot. By understanding your dot, all the positive things that come from being that person, all those things that come to it that might trigger other people's emotional responses, your feelings towards risk, it helps you stay strategic. And it helps you keep the group strategic by being aware that the way in which you operate might trigger someone else's response, even under these stressful, surprising, or threatening situations. So collectively, then, the group moves towards this aligned collaborative that I've described. Now, I'll share the presentation with everyone who'd registered today. There are links that are in this last slide or second to last slide to the individual assessments if you want to sign up for those. You can get more information on the board, executive, or group assessments that we offer. Our certificate in risk governance course, which several of the people I see in the session today have been through, includes this risk personality assessment. We think it's that important in terms of being effective at governing risk taking in the organization. And we invite you to join the DCRO community. We, again, are a peer collaboration of board members and C-suite executives trying to help each other embrace risk, govern risk taking well so their organizations are better at fulfilling their missions. We don't want things to knock us off course. So come join the community, take advantage of all the free resources we have and the networks we have. And as I mentioned, there's this article in Directors and Boards magazine that was just published a couple of weeks ago. If you click on that, it will take you to that article. So I'll, again, share this presentation with you. I'll share the slides with you. My contact information is here, and you can request more information about these with us.